Hello, welcome. Thank you for clicking on this video. Today we're going to make this ruffled crop top. I had a lot of inspiration from dainty vintage tops and wanted to create one on my own. For this project I used some old fabric I found in the basement, but I would definitely recommend to use lighter, breezier fabrics. Let's start. This top has three main sections: the bodice ruffles, and straps. In total, you will need to cut 7 pieces. The bodice is made out of one very long rectangle. The bodice straps are made up of 2 equally as long but skinnier rectangles. And finally, the straps are made up of a bodice strap sized rectangle cut in half and 2 shorter and even skinnier rectangles. These skinny rectangles I'm going to refer to as the strap's ruffle casings. For reference, here are my measurements of the pieces I cut out with seam allowance. Now keep in mind, these are the pieces measured before creating all the pleats and gathers. My body is definitely not 94 inches around, I just wasn't sure how much fabric the pleats would use up, so I used the entire length of the fabric. Also, a quick heads up on that some of these pieces will need to be cut on fold lengthwise, so my finished ruffles weren't 6 inches wide, they were about 3. I also wanted to include the size of my actual top to help you decide how big to cut your fabric pieces. I'm a size small, but I did cut off about 3 inches of extra fabric, so hopefully the measurements in the previous slide will work for you too. If anything, cut back on some of your pleats and ruffles and you should have enough fabric. I started off by creating 1/2 inch pleats along the entire bodice piece. This is the most time-consuming part of the entire top, but I think it's worth it for the detail it creates. Pin these in place to keep them down and iron them down so the pleats are crisp. After that, you are going to base stitch along the top and bottom of your fabric to keep the pleats in place without pins. Without all the pins in the way, it will be easier to sew down. When sewing down each pleat, try to sew as close to the folded edge of the pleat, and do this slowly to make sure the pleat stitch is as straight as possible. It will be very noticeable at the end if your pleats are sewn all wobbly, but don't worry because mine are not perfect either. Here are what my finished pleats sewn down look like. Now we are going to move on to the straps. I measured 3 inches and cut the fabric on fold. If you remember from earlier, this makes the unfolded piece 6 inches tall, but keep it folded. I pinned down the fabric to make sure it will stay put while I cut it, and cut down the entire length of my fabric. Use this piece you just cut as a template to cut 2 more long folded rectangles. For the first long folded rectangle, we are going to cut this in half. This will be used to create the straps. Base stitch the top. You can do this on a machine, but I thought it would be easier to do this by hand since the fabric was folded and thick because I was using a thicker fabric. Once you base stitch the entire length of your piece, pull on either ends of the thread to create ruffles. I needed the ruffles to measure 20 inches long, so I kept fiddling with the ruffles until it reached that length. Then to create the ruffle casings, I am cutting 2 rectangles also 20 inches long and 3 inches high. These do not need to be cut on fold. Then I am going to fold in a 1/2 inch on each side, then folding it again in half and ironing it. This way, only the pretty side shows and it becomes a case to hide the ugly edge of the ruffles. As you can see here, I am sandwiching the ruffles we created into the casing. Pin this down and sew as close as you can to the edge on the open side. And now your straps are completed. Moving on to the bodice ruffles, I basted the first long folded rectangle just as we did before. I made sure the ruffled piece was 35 inches long. In the video, you can see me trimming the other last folded rectangle to the same size as the ruffled piece, but this was a mistake because I ended up using a different pleat on the top, so do not trim your second rectangle. Pin the first ruffle right sides together onto the bottom piece of the bodice. For the top of the bodice, I decided to do some box pleats. I ended up running out of fabric since I trimmed it, but you can really do whatever pleat or ruffle that you want. I pinned it down so extra fabric was on top so I could fold over the fabric when I was sewing and create a clean edge. Then sew down the bottom and top ruffles. For the bottom ruffle, I just sewed close to the edge, giving myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance. For the top, I folded the extra fabric under the top so that it was nice and clean. This did make quite a thick layer to sew through, so please go slowly. Hand crank the sewing machine if need be. Also, please make sure you have lots of thread. When I thought I had 2 pleats left to sew, I realized my bobbin ran out of thread and had to redo the entire bunch, and I was upset. Then serge or cut off any excess fabric. I also decided to top stitch the bottom ruffle just to make it flatter and neater. This is what it should look like when you're done. Next, try on the bodice piece by wrapping it around your body. Make sure the ends overlap by a couple inches so you can add buttons. Mark where your buttons will be, but don't trim any excess fabric off in case you mess up. To close up my top, I used 2 hook and eyes on the top near the ruffles and 2 buttons. Then try the top on again once your buttons and hook and eyes are successfully sewn in. Now you will mark where you'll add your straps. Pin on your straps and make sure they are even. Once you are sure everything is perfect, sew it, cut off any excess fabric around the entire top to reduce bulk and hem all your edges. Now you're done, and thank you so much for watching.